I have published a book called How to Change the Way You Look at Things in Plain English, and this is going to be about the topic of that book. When you can change your perspective on something, it can really change everything. Change the way you feel about it, what you do about it, how you respond to it, everything. I think most of us probably know that, but normally the way your perspective is changed about something is by accident. Somebody says something, you read something, you see a book, you spend some time thinking, whatever, and it just occurs to you. But you can actually go a long way to making it happen. You can't really make it happen because unless you really believe the new perspective or really accept it or consider it valid, it won't change anything about how you perceive the event. So, on the one hand, you can deliberately take time and come up with different ways to look at something. That is something that you can do voluntarily. But unless you come up with something good that you believe or that you can accept, it won't change anything. So it is both something that it is in your control and is also, in a sense, out of your control. I have a recommendation for you while you're listening to this. If you can just take a moment and think about something that you consider to be a problem or something that you don't want and don't want to accept that's in your life, something important to you, and have that one thing in mind as you're listening to this. I'm going to be giving you examples, and here's one. We have 6 acres, and we have paths. It's basically there's no houses on this land. We just go out there and camp, and there are paths that we've created to get around on this property. And keeping the paths clear is a chore. It takes some work because they grow over really quickly. This is Western Washington we're talking about, and everything grows like crazy. Where the property is, it gets 62 inches of rain a year and lots of sunshine. So everything grows really abundantly. So we have to, prune the plants that are growing on the side of the path all the time, and plants that grow up on the path. So at first it was a real chore. It took time and effort, and my back got sore sometimes and so on. But we eventually set up a bin right near the center of the camp. And then whenever we prune something from the paths, we put it in that bin, and then we use it for chop and drop. I did a podcast on chop and drop earlier. It's a permaculture principle that you can take the chopped leaves, the cut off leaves from one plant, and place them around another plant, and it can really benefit that plant. So we've planted some fruit trees out there and other things that we would like to grow well. And we planted them out in a very, very sunny, hot, dry spot. So it can really make a difference to put chop and drop around it. So now when we're cutting the paths, we're also simultaneously creating chop and drop for these plants that we really want to grow. So we're getting 2 things out of one activity, and it has made it much less onerous. It's easier to do and more motivating to do because we're looking at it differently. So that's one example of how a change in perspective, a change in the way you look at something, can change how you feel about it and how you interact with it. When you can change how motivated you are to do something, how motivated you feel about doing it, it can really lighten the load. It can turn something from a chore into something that you're glad to do and motivated to do. And that makes a big difference in the quality of your life. Here's another example. Our property is 2 hours from where we live, and we like to go there and camp, but it's a 2-hour drive to it and 2-hour drive back. And for a while, that seemed kind of a chore, a waste of a lot of time. So we have started collecting things that we want to read, and then we have it in the car. We bring it with us, and then I read it to her. She usually does the driving because she's a better driver. And so I read it to her on the way down and on the way back. And so we're accomplishing 2 things at once, something we really want to do. So it's made it less of a chore and more something that we look forward to just by a change in perspective, just by looking at it differently. And one of the ways that we come up with a different way of looking at things is to take something that you don't like the thing that I asked you to think about earlier, to take the thing you don't like and say, how can I use this? How can I take advantage of this? Instead of this, I wish this wasn't here, or resisting it, or trying to make it take as little time as possible, or whatever, having something against it, to go, how can I use this as a resource? So this 2-hour trip down and back, how can I use that as a resource? Well, okay, we're in the same space together for 4 hours every time we take a trip. How can we use 4 hours together in the same space and make something good out of it? And we realize that she comes up with something that she wants to share with me or read together, and I come up with things that I would like to read to her that I haven't read yet, and sometimes things that I have read. And this is an opportunity where we're going to be sitting down together with nothing else to do. So we're actually saving the time in our normal life, in our regular life, and using the time that we're driving down there. So we've used it as a resource that can save us time in other places. So that's one way to come up with a new perspective on something, is to go, how can I use this? How can I consider this thing I don't want as a resource? And that's what we did with the chop and drop too. It's like we're spending time cutting off all these leaves so that we can walk these paths without having to plow through brush, and looking at that like, how can we use that as a resource? Those leaves have now become a resource that we're using and we're glad to have, making it more motivating and enjoyable to do. So ask yourself about your problem or your thing that you don't like or the thing that you resist. How can you use it as a resource? How can you see it as a resource? And it may not be possible. This is not a one size fits all. There's many different ways to change your perspective about something, and that is one way to approach it, is how can you use it as a resource? But if that doesn't work on that, if there's some problems that won't work on, then we're going to have other ideas here coming up soon. I've got a historical example of a change in perspective that really made a difference. So Sherman and Grant were in charge of the western part of the United States fighting the Civil War. And Sherman came up with this idea of plowing through the South and tearing up railroads and burning fields and just doing whatever kind of damage they could to the supply lines of the Confederate soldiers. The only problem is that every big army, and Sherman had a very big army, needs supplies. They need food. But if they were going to go that deep into the South, they would not have supplies with them. They couldn't bring enough supplies with them, and they couldn't keep their supply lines open, because the further in they got, the longer and more vulnerable their supply line would be. So Sherman came up with the idea, or Grant and Sherman together came up with the idea, that they could sever all communications and all supply lines and supply themselves as they plowed through the South. They could plunder the South to feed themselves while doing all this stuff. And it really was a brilliant strategy. So basically the problem was they couldn't do that because they didn't have any supply lines. But they kind of, one way to change your perspective on something is to assume that's good. Whatever you think is a problem, go, that's good. Now try to figure out how that's good. That's another way of coming up with a different perspective on something. So they're like, well, that's good. They can't have a supply line, so they're going to have to plunder the South to supply themselves, which will undermine the South even more, right? So they further along that line, they're like, if we plunder the South, not only will they have less food at the front and less clothing and less ammunition, but it will also really undermine the morale of the Confederate soldiers, knowing that their wives and children back home are being left destitute, because they would burn fields and take take the supplies of the plantations. And so the people back home, or the farms, or wherever, they targeted especially the wealthy. But the Confederate soldiers started deserting because they wanted to get back and protect their wives and children from the plundering that was being done by Sherman's army. So it was a different perspective on this, and it actually turned the tide of the war tremendously. It's kind of a famous thing that happened during the Civil War called Sherman's March to the Sea, because he marched all the way from the western part of what was then the America all the way to the coast through the South, just devastating the South and undermining their economic ability to sustain the war. And this idea was partly created by looking at what would be good about not having a supply line, and realizing they could take advantage of the fact that they don't have a supply line. So as they were marching, there was a huge army, and they were just marching through the South, and they would have all these soldiers on horseback going off to the left and the right of this army. They were plundering parties. They would find big plantations. They would take all of their stock food, ham and pigs and chickens and corn and whatever, and then they'd burn the place and bring all those goods back to the army to feed them. And there were some Confederate armies that tried to stop them from doing this, but they were a very large army and very well fed. And so they defeated everybody that tried to attack them and just kept on their way. And it really did undermine the whole Confederate cause and really went a long way to creating the defeat of the Confederate army. So that's another way to try to change your perspective on something that you're resisting, is to take the opposite point of view and say, what's good about this? Or just assume that it's good, and then try to figure out how that could be good. And one way that can help you think about that is to imagine someone being really glad about this problem. Imagine someone having the same problem, someone else having the same problem, and imagine that person being really glad that they have that problem, and then try to imagine how anyone could be glad about it. How? And just use your imagination. And when you're using your imagination like this, it's okay to be silly, to come up with stupid ideas. As a matter of fact, that's a really good way to do it, is you sit down and you try to come up with 10 ideas of how somebody could think this is a good thing. Just write them down. It really makes you squeeze out every last little bit of creativity you have on that subject. And let some of the ideas be stupid. It's okay. Because sometimes when you come up with a stupid idea, it helps you think of another idea. It stretches the boundaries of what you're thinking within. So these are things that you can ask yourself that can help you change your perspective on something. Is ask yourself, how can I use this? Or what's good about this? Or what could be good about this? How could it be turned to your advantage? Or to ask yourself, is this, or could this be considered an untapped resource? Another example would be, we are now in the coronavirus crisis. This is now July of 2020 that I'm speaking this. And it has clearly been a miserable, terrible thing for most people. And also, some people are taking advantage of their unusual circumstances. They are, in a sense, changing their perspective on it from just it's obviously a bad thing, but how could I use this already existing circumstance to do something good? How can I make it an advantage? How can I see this as a resource? And so on. Some parents are bonding more closely with their children. They will probably never get another chance like this in their whole lives, to spend so much time with their children. My niece loves to paint, but never has the time. And she's ended up doing a lot of painting, and she calls them the pandemic paintings. She's done a whole bunch of them, and she's gotten really good. Some people are reading more. They finally have the time to read. A friend of mine took the opportunity to change careers, something he just didn't find the time to do before. So he's taken online classes, and he's earned certifications and licenses, and he's going to be already trained for his new career when this thing is over. Some companies are discovering that their employees working from home is great. It lowers their overhead. It's also great for the society. There's less traffic, there's less pollution. Some of these things that have changed during this crisis are going to stay. Now that people have found out how to do it, they're going to keep it. Like, for example, having doctor's visits, having remote doctor's visits. Some of that is going to save a lot of money and time and pollution and trouble for people to be able to do things that they could do and could have always done from home. Or not always, but since we've had the technology, they've been able to do this kind of thing, like people working from home or doing doctor consultations from home at somebody's home. But nobody's gotten around to changing over whatever systems needed to be done in order to make that happen. But now that they have, I'm sure a lot of this is going to be kept because it's better, it's more efficient, it's less of a waste of people's time and money. So that's an example of taking something that's clearly bad. And there are not very many people that would consider this coronavirus crisis good. But in your individual life, how can you use this as a resource? It does exist. Here it is. That is always a good candidate for a shift in perspective, to look at something differently, is if you have a circumstance that's clearly bad and you don't like it, but it already exists, how can you look at it differently so that you interact with it differently, or so that you feel differently about it, or so you can take advantage of it, to use it as an opportunity of some sort? Changing your perspective can obviously make a huge difference. And it's not difficult. This is not like some tricky little technique. All you do is you ponder a question and come up with ideas and make notes. That's probably a good thing to add. Make notes while you're coming up with ideas. And that's it. That's the whole technique. To ask good questions. I mean, the questions have to be good. Not, why is this happening to poor me? That's not a good question. Not very productive, and it won't change your perspective very well. But to ask yourself, what might be good about this? How could this be a resource? How could I take advantage of this? What if I thought this was good? How could I possibly think this is good? In what ways would somebody be thinking about this if they thought it was good? You can try other perspectives from other people. Like, how would Abraham Lincoln think this is a good thing? How would a plumber think this is a good thing? How would an MIT genius think this is a good thing? How would they take advantage of it? How would they think of it as a resource? It really helps to get outside your own limited, because everybody's limited in some way in the way that they think about things. You're thinking within a box, whether you know it or not, right? And so by thinking about somebody else thinking about it can actually get you outside the limits of your own box, or it can help anyway. So that's it. That's the whole technique, is you ponder a question, come up with ideas, jot them down. And one of those, or maybe more than one of those, might drastically change the way you look at things, making you feel less bad about something, and making you change your behavior in a way that really takes advantage of it or does something good with it, rather than just being a victim of it. Here's another example. This is kind of a bizarre one, but I think it's really interesting. A hypnotist had a client that had no physical reason to have paralyzed legs, but her legs were paralyzed. She couldn't walk. So the hypnotist hypnotized her, put her in a trance, and asked her unconscious mind, what's the deal? Why are her legs paralyzed? And in trance, her unconscious mind said, she doesn't stand up for herself. The hypnotist, who had a really good facility with changing perspectives, said, well, she's not getting the communication. How about if you make her legs paralyzed only when she is actively not standing up for herself? Then she would get the message more easily. The unconscious mind said, okay, that sounds reasonable. And so the hypnotist gave the post-hypnotic suggestion that when she's not standing up for herself, her legs would give out. And sure enough, when she came to, almost immediately her husband said something, and she just went along with it, and her legs buckled. And within a very short time, she started standing up for herself all the time. So that's taking something definitely bad, paralyzed legs, that's definitely bad, and doing something good with it. You can use that technique for anything, really. I mean, if you have a sore knee, and you're trying to remember to do something like show your wife you love her. Every time your knee aches, every time you're aware that your knee hurts, you could say to yourself, I'm going to show my wife I love her today, right? So it can just become something that connects, that reminds you to do something, some change that you want to make. You can use anything. It doesn't matter. That's also a different way you can deal with that is if the knee soreness was a communication from your body or from your unconscious mind to you, what is the message? It's another way to ponder and get a different perspective on something that's clearly bad. And it might be complete nonsense, but it might not be. It obviously worked for this lady with the paralyzed legs, and I've read lots of stories about and had experiences myself where something was, you could easily consider it a communication from the unconscious mind that's useful. It's a different way to look at something in a new way. Here's another example. When I was in high school, I was an athlete. I ran track. And before a race, my heart would be pounding. Clearly, I had adrenaline pumping through my body. And I couldn't make it go away. I couldn't stop it. I clearly found it uncomfortable. But I had been pre-given a different perspective on it, because I remember reading a story about an old lady who heard her husband yell out, and he was under the car and the jack had given out and the car was on top of him. And the old lady lifted up the car enough for him to get out from under it. And the story had been explaining that you can get a kind of superhuman power when you have that much adrenaline. So I just took that as my perspective on my own adrenaline flood before a race and figured that's probably making me faster. It changed the way I thought about the jitters. And so I accepted them. I didn't try to resist them or I didn't, one way I could have handled that is just not do it anymore, just not run any races because it's just too uncomfortable, or to think that there's something wrong with me, or to try to calm down, all of those would have been a different way of approaching it based on a different way of looking at it. And the way I looked at it worked really well. I did well. I accepted completely that my heart was pounding and embraced it, thought it was a good thing. I'm going to leave you with one more example. This is from the book Alive and the movie. If you haven't seen it, really good. It's a true story. This was a group of athletes that were flying over the Andes when their plane crashed into the mountain. They were in a seriously dire situation in the middle of nowhere, and nobody knew where they were. So they were hoping for rescue, of course, and they had a radio. They figured out how to use this radio, and so they were listening, and they heard that there was a search. And they all had their hopes up for a long time, and they were slowly starving to death and freezing because they were up in the snow. And then one day they heard the search was called off. And of course, most people were devastated by this news, but there was one guy who was happy. He's like, now we can start thinking about getting ourselves out of here, instead of sitting around helplessly waiting for somebody else to come save us. He's like, now we can seriously start to just figure out how we can get ourselves out of here. And that's ultimately what they did. Three of them hiked out of there. Well, three of them took off, and then one guy came back. But the other two hiked their way out of the Andes and found civilization and rescued everybody else. So that was a good example of, in this case, it wasn't one person changing their perspective. It was one person changing everybody else's perspective. They had a negative, hopeless, victim-like perspective. And he said, no, this is good. Instead of just sitting around doing nothing while we waste away, we should start immediately affecting our own rescue. And they did. And he was one of the two guys that made it out and rescued everybody else. That's a good example of how a different perspective only, just looking at something in a different way, can completely change the trajectory of your life and other people's lives. And all you got to do is ask yourself some good questions or a good question and really give it some time trying to come up with answers until you come up with something that really clicks for you, that really makes you see things in a different way, that really feels right to you, and that can completely change your life. This is Adam Lee Kahn on The Atom Bomb. This Atom Bomb podcast episode is sponsored by Anchor, a podcast platform, the one I'm using to make this podcast. It's super easy to use and allows you to easily create your own podcast. You can record and edit your audio right onto the app. In fact, you can do everything on your phone. Anchor also makes it easy to monetize your podcast and get wide distribution. Anchor automatically makes your podcast available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. You can download the Anchor app for free or go to anchor.fm to get started.